from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Well, welcome to STRAT and welcome to July, and I'm going to talk about a number of things that are out there basically focused on Ukraine. And it's about time, frankly, with everything going on in the Middle East and elsewhere around the world. Ukraine has been something that I haven't talked about for a bit, and there are some big things happening. Now, just a reminder, STRAT's changed. It used to be that we were doing routinely STRAT podcasts for about 30 to 40 minutes. All right, now we're going to be doing STRAT podcasts for maybe about 15 to 20 minutes, but we'll be doing them twice a week. So it'll be more current, obviously more current, more topical, not just for the full week, but really getting into what's happening around the world. So let me get into what's happening right now with Ukraine and talk about the war. You may have seen reports that North Korea is looking at sending 30,000 troops to Russia. All right, now that's a lot of troops. That's much larger than what they've ever done before. Previously, and I should mention, these troops are obviously intended for their war effort against Ukraine. They have been using troops to fight against Ukrainian army. All right, so this is not new, but previously they had sent about 11,000. Now, those 11,000 troops were really chewed up in the fighting. They were poorly employed by the Russians. For that matter, the Russians seem to have every cross-cultural language problem you can possibly imagine trying to work with the North Koreans. The North Koreans may have lost somewhere about a third of the 11,000 troops, is maybe even more than that. There were projections early on when they went in there that if they kept at the same loss, that last April at some point they would have lost all the North Korean troops, but they pulled them back and put them on other duties because the North Korean losses were so great. But now they're sending out 30,000. What will be the training of these troops? Not quite clear. The training that they had before was very perfunctory. Those were some of the, quote, elite troops, if you will, special forces, special operations type troops that North Korea had sent, and the Russians employed them very poorly and ended up getting a lot of them killed. And so we'll see what happens with this. We'll see if the 30,000 actually do show up, but they likely will. One thing North Korea likes about it is they get paid well by the Russians to send these troops in there. They're basically using them essentially like mercenaries, if you will. And the troops go in there, they get better fed, they get better equipment, uniforms, stuff like that. And so there's a lot of reasons why. Now, some pretty draconian conditions that were put on them. Basically, they told them if they get captured, they will kill their families back in North Korea. And that was to avoid having North Korean POWs showcased in front of the television cameras. So some pretty draconian things that they have put on these troops. But this is a huge commitment of troops, and it comes while Russia is in the middle of what is essentially a large summer offensive. They have been flowing troops in and around the borders of Ukraine, that defensive line or that offensive line, depending on how you want to interpret it. They may have about 50,000 troops concentrated up in Sumy, up in north of Sumy, to the north, south of Kursk. And this was part of the push that was getting the Ukrainian troops out of the Kursk Oblast, which is a Russian province or Russian oblast. It looks like, as far as I can tell, most of the Ukrainian, maybe all the Ukrainian troops are out of Kursk Oblast now. They may control a little bit of it, but not much. But they've been concentrating this 50,000 troops for a big push. One of the things I want to point out that seems to get somewhat lost is you have to have an overwhelming superiority in numbers for the offensive. So if you're going against, say, 10,000 troops dug in, which all the Ukrainian troops are well dug in, well fortified positions, then you're looking at, if you had really good troops and great equipment and everything else, you'd look at least 3-1 advantage. So if you had 10,000 Ukrainians on a particular sector and you want to do an offensive movement, you'd want to have 30,000 troops. However, with the Russians, they'd probably want to have 5, 6, 7-1 because, frankly, Russian troops are lousy. They suck, all right? Their tactics are very simplistic. Their leadership is absolutely horrible. They don't take care of their equipment. They use these incredibly stupid meat wave attacks where they just get up and rush into the enemy, and they just get chewed to pieces with machine gun fire, indirect fire, some mortars, artillery, everything else. And of course, the thing that's really decimating them is the first-person view FPV drones. In fact, they say 70% of the casualties on the Ukrainian war battlefields are due to drones now. So it is a very different war than we've seen in the past, but the Russians keep doing this stuff, and they keep getting a lot of people killed. And so it's anticipated they will continue to do that, and there might be some horrendous losses suffered. Now, they have been losing somewhere, I've been seeing somewhere between 900 to 1,400 troops a day. That's an amazing loss. Obviously, in Western terms, it would be unfathomable for us to be involved in a war where we had losses that great. I mean, Congress would be up in arms. The country would be in revolt if we were doing something like that. But Russia's different. Russia's used to having huge losses historically, and it's a dictatorship for all intents and purposes. So, and if you protest, police come out and round you up and you disappear for a while. So you don't see those protests, but the losses are being felt across Russian society. And it's because of these huge losses that obviously they want to get the North Koreans in there to use the North Koreans as cannon fodder to absorb some of these losses. So there could be some pretty horrific losses with those North Korean troops if they go in. Now, Russia to date has lost, and this was last month, they went over 1 million men lost. According to British intelligence, about half of those, maybe a little more than half, were KIA, killed in action. A lot of them were seriously wounded. A lot of them were, disabled, if you will, sent back. And everything I'm hearing out of Russia is that they treat disabled veterans horribly. It's a disgrace the way they treat them. And if you treat your veterans with contempt and disregard, that eventually starts to burble up. And what you're seeing is the Russians are not paying for the war, essentially. They're not paying for the fact that they're getting people disabled, seriously injured, whatever. They're just not absorbing that cost. They're just bringing them back, throwing them on society, and doing the absolute bare minimum. That will cause the seeds of greater discontent throughout Russian society the longer it goes on. So we'll see what that comes out. The Russian gains are slow. They're ponderous. They don't make huge gains on the battlefield except by incurring tremendous losses in personnel, armor, everything else. If you look at the loss of tanks, armor personnel carrier, artillery, everything else that's out there, that's also huge. Also, Russia is taking a lot of hits. Some of them very tangible, hitting things like major manufacturing for arms, for example, drones and other things they need during the war. Some of them dealing with critical infrastructure like oil facilities, and then, of course, hitting things like fighter bombers. They had that amazing Operation Spiderweb where they covertly sent in all those trucks full of drones, and the drones popped out and destroyed dozens of Russian bombers. And Russia doesn't have that many bombers, so these are strategic bombers, but they were being used for conventional purposes. But these deep strikes are unnerving for Russia across the board, and you can tell they're unnerving because Putin and the Kremlin don't like to talk about it. They keep it very quiet about this stuff, and that tells you just how concerned they are. And when you see things, several hundred miles or almost 1,000 miles away from the Ukrainian border going up in flames, and a city is watching, huge plumes of smoke coming up from a manufacturing facility or from an oil facility or something like that, they know that something's going on. And of course, word travels fast, and if people hear drones or see drones, that's going to travel really fast throughout that city, and it makes people wonder about what everything else that Russia or the Kremlin is telling them if they're taking these hits deep inside society. So this is all happening. This is happening there. All right. Now for Russia, this may be their last big shot. The politics are changing, and for Russia, if they're going to make gains on the battlefield, they may be looking at this summer as their big shot. They're also making some claims that I don't know if that really it's Russia making claims. They may have done quite a bit. They're claiming Luhansk Oblast, of course, that's half of the Donbass, if you will, that they've claimed there. That's one of the oblasts or provinces they claimed are intrinsically sovereign territory. So they're putting out that claim. I haven't heard the Ukrainians say that that's happened by any means, but that's not unusual that Russia will make these overarching claims on territory that they haven't quite seized, just for internal consumption with the Russian audience, if you will. Putin and some of his cohorts have been also kind of doubling down, if you will, repeating their earlier claims that all of Ukraine is intrinsically Russian territories. whatever they say about Luhansk, I say, okay, big deal, but they're also at the same time saying that all of Ukraine is Russian territory as well. So I think what Putin is right now desperately trying to show some significant battlefield success with all these things going up in flames all over Russia, deep within Russian territory, Russian people asking questions of what exactly is really going on. And I'm sure the word of 1,000 Russians dead or seriously injured or disabled out of this war, that million man loss, if you will, that has got to be seeping through Russian society, and that's a number that hopefully will have something going on there. Now, also at the same time, there's a little bit of a concern. For whatever reason, the White House and the Pentagon have stopped shipping arms, particularly air defense missiles, to Ukraine. This is a time when Russia is sending the largest drone and missile attacks into Ukraine at any time during this war. GOP members of Congress, and obviously a lot of Democrats, are demanding an explanation as to why this is. Reports out of Poland are that stuff was all ready to go into Ukraine, and literally the U.S. stopped it right at the border. So this wasn't something in the U.S. where they suddenly said we have to divert missiles to some other thing within the U.S., send them over to the Middle East or some over the Pacific or something like this. This is stuff that we had already sent. It was already in Poland, ready to go into Ukrainian territory, and it was stopped. And a lot of it was reportedly artillery ammunition. It wasn't air defense missiles. And I say that because the Pentagon rationale or reason they gave for the suspension was that certain things like Patriot missiles, air defense missiles and stuff were needed elsewhere, and that's why we had to stop sending stuff. But they have stopped stuff at the border with Poland that was not just air defense missiles. It was artillery and other things that were going in. So it's a little bit confusing. Obviously, for a lot of members of Congress, they're demanding an explanation. They'd like to know. I can only imagine the concern this has with our European allies as to what is the U.S. position, particularly right after the NATO conference took place. And I would mention, though, in the backdrop, Europe has been stepping up to fill the aid gap, the military aid gap that the U.S. has left by no longer pledging anything more. So they've been moving very quickly. They haven't filled this gap. This is stuff they thought was going in. So we'll see if the Europeans are able to ramp up a little bit more. But the Europeans are kind of, in terms of ramping up, are about ramped as far as they can with what they have, although they're building defense industrial-based capability much, much further. Finally, let me just leave you with this. Reports have come out that there are secret Russian documents and things like this that Russia is very worried about China. And one of the things that they're worried about, there was a very large article that was written about this, is about Russia taking essentially Siberia, or what we would consider Siberia. This goes back to, and I'm sure this is all right on the tip of your tongue, the Amur annexation between 1858 and 1860. You, like me, who can forget all the things that happened between 1858 and 1860 in the Russian Far East and China? I mean, it just comes readily to mind, sure. And this is when the Russian Empire essentially annexed territories along the Amur River. This is the northern part of China, if you will. And this was during the Chinese Qing dynasty. All right. Again, I'm sure everyone here is well versed in all of this. This was achieved through a series of very coercively imposed treaties by Imperial Russia. The Treaty of Agon in 1858 was the first one, and then the Treaty of Beijing in 1860. And basically, it was Imperial Russia with a lot of troops on a very weak Imperial China, basically imposing its will and taking not just those territories, basically taking a big chunk of Siberia all the way out to include Vladivostok, which I should mention, China in recent years uses the Chinese name for Vladivostok, not Vladivostok whenever they talk about it, which is a little bit of a point, kind of a part of a soft invasion China's been doing in that area. Now, this territory up there is a far bigger prize in terms of natural resources and certainly in terms of just raw territory than Taiwan. You know, Taiwan is the Porcupine Island nation. You know they're going to take phenomenal losses trying to take Taiwan. They're going to have, that Taiwan Straits is going to be, I don't know if it'd be lined with iron, but it'll be, there's going to be a lot of ships sunk out there and everything else. And they realize that it's becoming increasingly more and more difficult for them to try and achieve that. However, I have always thought that a lot of this was just classic misdirection and deception, because the Chinese territorial claims on that territory for the Amur annexation, that whole Siberian territory, their claims up there to the north are, I would say, as strong, historically speaking, as their claims are for Taiwan. All right, and certainly it's a much bigger price for them. It would portend a lot more for China economically if they could take that territory to the north. Russia apparently is secretly looking at this going, we're a little bit nervous. And of course, Russia has also, they have over the last few years, they have literally gutted their Far East forces in order to support the war in Ukraine. So, and their country is, by many estimates, economically speaking, and some would say to some extent politically speaking, almost a vassal state of China. The PRC keeps them afloat. If it wasn't for the PRC, Russia couldn't do the war in Ukraine. All right, Russia would probably collapse economically if it wasn't for China. So in other words, this is almost, historically speaking, the military power reverse of what we saw between 1858 and 1860, where this massively powerful Imperial Russian force came in and literally imposed these treaties coercively on the somewhat hollowed out, very weak Qing dynasty. Well, they're kind of switching that whole thing around. And Xi Jinping is probably smiling when he thinks about this, because this is basically changing a great historical wrong in his mind. And by the way, for decades, they've been doing a soft invasion up there. If you go to Vladivostok and other cities along the border with Russia, the Russian cities on the border with China, I should say, you'll see lots of signs in Chinese, huge influx of Chinese. I don't know if they're all citizens of China, but, there's been basically a big movement of people into these areas. So there's been a soft invasion for place. And of course, that area has enormous wealth and enormous potential in terms of oil, gas, minerals, to include some rare earths and things that they need, lumber, a variety of other natural resources that China would desperately needs to support what they're trying to do. And it would also make China really far more, geographically speaking, an Arctic power. And the Arctic is a big area of expansion for all countries in the north. And what would the U.S. do? Well, frankly, I don't know what the U.S. would do. In our grand strategy, do we really we're not going to put forces into Russia to defend Russian territory against the Chinese. I just don't ever see a scenario where we would do that. I don't see Japan or South Korea wanting to get involved with that either. And frankly, they may look at it and say, they have to do their own calculus. Is this a gain or a loss? How does this change? What we're looking at further out. Same thing with our other allies in the Pacific. Europe's going to have to make that assessment. India, which is in a bit of a friction confrontation with China right now, they certainly wouldn't like it. On the other hand, it's moving Chinese military resources, Chinese attention to the north, which moves it away from the south. And that, of course, India might say, well, if China is tied up dealing with this thing up north in Siberia, that's less that they can dedicate to doing anything in the south along the Himalayas or anything like that. So India might say this maybe not be the worst thing. Anyway, to paraphrase the famous Chinese saying, and some would say the famous Chinese curse, we live in interesting times. Hey, thanks for listening to STRAT. Also, please visit stratpodcast.com. Also, you can go to my YouTube channel, Hal Kempfer TV, and we also have halkempfertv.com as well out there. And if you can always go to my corporate website at gripsa.com. And thanks again, and I hope you like this shorter format.